Critique Mexico Ag Exim.
Mexico Ag 1. Mexico Ag 1. Whenever you are ready.
I'm noticing a trend here. The tuner is making a lot of assertions without contextualizing any of his arguments to the affirmative. He's making a lot of broad-based epistemology and does not address any of our specific authors. He's making a lot of claims about the affirmative being racist, but he's not addressing any of the 1AC cards, addressing how the 1AC would actually be implemented in the affirmative as a remedy to solve racism and structural violence. The first argument is warming climate disproportionately affects those who are not responsible, the least wealthy, and the people of color. That's a per capita evidence. Since African Americans are 20% less GHG, but still feel environmental risk compounded upon themselves because of social inequality. This has also led to unequal access to resources because slavery's legacy, which locks in differential experiences of climate injustice. That means this is an example of the 1AC talking about racism in society, which meets all of their frameworks and links to omission. Second is war. They've conceded that war would exacerbate systemic impacts. The systemic impacts they're talking about, there's no root cause, but it fuels xenophobia. People turn inward and become more likely to be racist. This is the gold standard evidence. Now, these are reasons why the 1AC is able to address racism in a way that they have an answer. They've also conceded that the 1AC is a good response. The 1AC is a good response to racism because we correct the current corn consumption, which is a neoliberal policy. We talk about the 1.2 billion people in the most marginalized countries who are going to starve if the plan is implemented. They have not addressed the fact that they have no way to remedy this if they don't work within the state. We've also addressed the autonomy of the Mexican farmer. We are reversing the NAFTA agriculture correctionalism that have caused imperialism in Mexico. We are allowing the farmers to be autonomous. Now, they say this is never going to happen. Look, they have no evidence talking about how the U.S. is going to implement biofuel policy. All of our evidence about the U.S. being able to reform itself that I'll extend later are reasons why the U.S. will be able to implement these policies in a good way. Now, the framework debate, the entirety of the top of the 1 year was that we should be able to weigh the plan. They've also given reasons why we're not role playing. We never claim to be the USFG, but organizational decision making, meaning we can learn about within and working within the federal government is key. Organizational decision making is key to making productive policies in the future. Utilitarianism should be preferred here because it is like a counterplan. We're allowing for the greatest good for the greatest number. It's better to resolve structural inequalities because their will can never resolve our impacts. The magnitude of racism impacts can be resolved within the world of the affirmative that was above, but utils not racist in this instance because it can solve their impacts. Now, they say the U.S. always uses excuses to intervene. They have no evidence specific to the mechanisms, but the Clark evidence says that we cannot make prophecies of doom about USFG society. They cannot exaggerate racism, the number one root cause of oppression, because that is dysfunctional. There is an advancement possible. The U.S. has acted in the past and can act in the future to resolve things. The rainbow evidence says that state acting specifically to solve warming is crucial, and it wouldn't be racist because they are implementing increasingly egalitarian policies. We also have the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, which proves that the state is able to comprehend the impacts of racism. That means state action is not racist. State can resolve it. Now, the epistemology debate, the whiteness studies, they have not answered any of our arguments and evidence. The whiteness studies are arbitrary in concept. They are not applied. They do not employ scholarly standards. They do not have any concrete evidence, and they employ a sloppy methodology. This is unharnessed evidence. Just because the author is white doesn't mean that they are wrong. They cannot judge. This is an unfounded claim. The tuner cannot just blow off our arguments because our author is white. That is not an argument. They're not addressing the thesis of what we're saying. The Baudreau evidence says that they are not a root cause claim or to any reform is possible. The U.S. is not founded on slavery. It proves that their epistemology is flawed because the U.S. is able to reform itself. It is a myth that the USFG was founded solely on slavery. Now, the Mexico advantage, no two-in-our explanation of these terms, and there was no impact to them. Now, there's no impact to them. If the plan is able to resolve instances of racism, then we saw the impact of those terms. Now, food prices advantage. Food prices will throw 1.2 billion people into starvation, and the status quo and the alternative or the criticism is never able to resolve that. That's a run-in in our evidence. Billions cannot feed their families, children, or themselves because they're using corn to fuel our SUVs. This is a systemic impact that is questionable. Even if the U.S. did take corn in the past to fuel our cars, this is something that we need to remedy conformity through the use of the authentic warranted analysis that the U.S. is neither irredeemable racist nor imperialist. It's capable of benign actions, and this is an example. Bryce cites 17 different studies which prove the link between biofuels and corn prices only solving the food for fuel trade-off and transitioning the U.S. away from corn to oil prices. That's the McDonald's evidence. They say the U.S. takes all food. That's the only thing they've said. No, that's not true. This is another example of them making assertions without claims, assertions without warrants. The U.S. would not take their food. The U.S. is doing that in the status quo. The plan is what reverses that. Now, the extreme advantage. They say that our discourse of catastrophe reifies consumption patterns. They spun this as an apocalypse, this is an argument. Their evidence just says painting government global warming is irreversible and addressing consumption patterns is bad. The AFT does not address warming as irreversible. The AFT says that we can reverse it through biofuel policy, which addresses consumption patterns. Also, they say we'll consume until we die. And this is another example of them not having a warrant to back this claim up. All of the internal links to our biofuels demand prove that we will use the biofuels to be sustainable and to provide energy that is equalitarian. Egalitarian.
And we got that on camera too.